Thank you very much, Luis, and good afternoon, everyone. Conscious everyone has been enjoying some of the good food here, so hopefully we've got a very interesting session coming up, which should be get all of your appetites ready before lunch. So in this panel, we will be focusing on investment-friendly licensing frameworks. For my first part of the presentation, I'm going to focus in particular on some of the research that GSMAi and GSMAi Intelligence has done around spectrum pricing, and then I'll be inviting up some very distinguished panel members to talk about spectrum pricing and spectrum frameworks from the perspective of non-operators. So, before getting into the implications of spectrum pricing, I think it's quite helpful to think about, when we talk about spectrum costs, what actually drives spectrum costs? Why are spectrum costs? We observe, as we will see shortly, that spectrum costs can be very different from country to country. Why is this? And there's a few factors. One is the market-driven price of spectrum, particularly where operators pay for spectrum in auctions. They often drive the price based on what they're willing to bid. And this is something we refer to as the market-driven price of spectrum. There's a market for mobile services. Operators are willing to pay for the spectrum to provide those. But it's not just market forces that drive spectrum prices. It's also determined by policy and regulatory choices as well. And we've identified some examples there. So outside of market forces, policymakers and regulators can impact spectrum prices through reserve prices, annual fees, so not when spectrum is auctioned, but often there are accompanying annual fees or possibly license obligations. They can also be driven by other factors like spectrum scarcity. If there's not as much spectrum assigned, then operators will often be having to pay different amounts. They can be driven by not having a clear spectrum roadmap or certainty about the spectrum that will be released. And even in an auction, things like auction formats can drive spectrum prices too. So how does spectrum impact investment? So for a number of years, there was a very significant debate both within the economics field but also outside as to whether spectrum costs even actually mattered for things like investment and consumer prices. On one side, there was an argument that said spectrum is a sunk cost. It's incurred as a one-off. It can't be recovered thereafter. So one aspect of economic theory says that shouldn't really feed into pricing or investment because the operator has incurred the cost. It doesn't impact forward-looking decisions. That was one argument. On the other side, particularly in the telecommunications sector, which incurs a lot of fixed costs and operators have to make long-term investments, there was the argument that said actually spectrum costs will impact investment because it feeds into operators' decisions and strategies around how to recover those investments. So we had these two sides of the argument, but there wasn't much evidence to support or to determine which of these was actually reflective of reality. So a few years ago, the GSMAi Intelligence, we published an empirical study. You're welcome to discuss the details at lunchtime in terms of methodology and data, but we published it on the GSMAi website, and we also published it in an academic journal because it was such an important question. We were very keen to subject the analysis we did to external review. And the key findings that we found were that spectrum, the amount of spectrum assigned and the timing were important, but the cost of spectrum really did impact two key factors, in particular coverage and quality. So we talk about investment. It's worth remembering that all of us, I assume everyone here is a consumer of mobile services. It's worth remembering investment is a means to an end. I don't necessarily care about what my operator is investing. What I care about is I want to have coverage pretty much everywhere I go. I want to have a good quality of service that I can do whatever I want to on my mobile phone, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's watching a video, making a payment. That's really what I care about. Obviously, the investment drives that. So what we focused on was let's focus on the outcomes that consumers really care about. They care about coverage and they care about quality. And what we found was in both low and middle income and high income countries that had higher spectrum costs tended to see, they did see slower deployment of new generations of networks. This was looking at the last decade, so 4G was the key focus. And also it was impacting network quality on metrics like download speeds and latencies. So we're not saying here that spectrum costs in themselves have a negative impact. What we're saying is that spectrum costs that are driven over and above the market, the level that would otherwise be set in by market forces, that's the key challenge. I've talked about, in particular, spectrum costs, but there are other aspects we looked in our study. Just 2 key points I wanted to highlight. So, yes, the cost is important, but also the amount of spectrum is important. I think the last panel articulated very clearly why the amount of spectrum impacts quality and coverage by reducing the cost needed to deploy networks. So indeed, we found that operators and countries that had assigned more spectrum tended to have higher levels of network quality. They tended to have higher levels of coverage. And they also, those that assigned spectrum earlier tended to see faster deployment of networks. So nothing, we would probably all expect this, but I think it's helpful to have the empirical evidence to support this. So these are the key findings. Let's focus on I wanted to focus on 2 particular points here. So the amount of spectrum we know is important, and the cost of spectrum is really important. So obviously, being in Cairo now, we've actually been doing some benchmarking on some of these factors in the Middle East and North African region. So let's look at some of the variations by country, just to sort of highlight what we see. So here in this chart, we've got the amount of spectrum that has been assigned to operators. It's not what has been allocated to mobile, but it's the amount of spectrum that has actually been assigned and can be utilized by mobile operators for countries in Middle East and North Africa. So we split them into low bands, so below 1 gigahertz, lower mid bands between 1 and 3, and the upper mid band range. And what we see within this region is there is quite significant amounts of variation in the spectrum assigned. We've got countries, particularly in the GCC, that have high levels of spectrum assigned, partly driven by the 3.5 gigahertz range for those that have launched 5G, but that's not the only factor. You can see in red there that some countries haven't assigned all of the available spectrum to mobile operators in low bands and also low mid bands. So the key point here is that in a number of countries, we talked about how the amount of spectrum assigned can impact quality and coverage, and so there are a number of areas where policymakers and regulators in some countries could drive that going forward. Then the next part that we looked at or we highlighted was around cost. So for the countries where we've gathered data for, we look at spectrum cost. Just to explain the metric here, so there's different ways of measuring spectrum costs. What we want to capture here is the overall spectrum cost burden. So how do we do that? We take all of the spectrum cost components, so those spectrum costs that are paid in auctions or as renewals, as upfront costs, we annualize them based over the license length, so that allows us to incorporate those, and we include the annual fees as well as license fees. We then express that as a proportion of revenue because that reflects the size of the market. If you just compared spectrum costs in dollar terms or in currency terms, you would find a lot of variation that doesn't reflect the fact that some markets are higher value than others. So again, the key takeaway from here is that within the region, we see quite significant variation in the amount that operators pay for spectrum, going from close to sort of 0 to 1% to almost 20%. So again, when we talked about the findings, the analysis before around the impact of spectrum costs on network quality and investment, we can see here that countries have seen different evolutions of spectrum costs, and that there can be, going forward, particularly for the countries that have higher spectrum costs, this is something that needs to be considered in terms of enabling investment. So, key findings from the research we've done. So, the first point is the research we've done does show that spectrum costs do impact investment. We know in not all countries, but in a number of countries, spectrum is often used as a way to maximize revenues for public resources and government funding. That in itself is a legitimate objective. Governments do need to seek public funding, and spectrum is a way of doing that. But what the research shows is that there is a trade-off, or as we say in the economics literature, there's no free lunch. There is a trade-off between trying to maximize revenues and then enabling a more wider connectivity and improved network quality. So this is something that policymakers and regulators have to balance based on their objectives. A few other findings I think I've already covered. So auctions in general can be an efficient way to incite spectrum to its most efficient use, but if in some cases we have seen them designed in a way that they do lead to inefficient outcomes. Higher reserve prices is an example there. Third one, which is artificially limiting the supply of spectrum. An example is set-asides, can also slow services and inflate prices. And then the last recommendation that comes from our research is that ideally spectrum should be released as soon as there's a business case to use it. So I think that summarizes some of the key insights I wanted to bring from this. If you obviously have any questions about the research we've done, definitely happy to pick this up afterwards. But now I would like to invite three of my fellow panelists to come up. So if I could ask you all to come up and sit down. Firstly, we've got Dr. Mustafa Almahdi from the ITU. Thank you very much. Could I also ask Eslam Aboudonia if you could take a seat as well? And Currin as well from Aetha Consulting. Thank you. Right. The reason why I'm quite excited about this panel is you've heard from, obviously, Luis and Amra and myself offering the insights from the perspective of GSMAi. But I think what's great about this panel is we've got insights and perspectives from different organizations. So ITU, Ericsson being a vendor, and Cameron working at a consultancy who's worked on spectrum auctions, spectrum assignments in a range of countries. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Mustafa, perhaps we could hear some of your thoughts from the perspective of the ITU and how they perceive, and how ITU perceives spectrum best practice and policy.
Thank you, Kalvin. Good afternoon, everybody. It's given me great pleasure to be with you here today for this GSMAi workshop. I'm very happy to join my colleagues. I hope that I can share some insights and perspectives from ITU. So I will start by our ITU mission, which is mainly connecting unconnected. So to attend to that mission, I think we at ITU, we work closely with our member states. And as you know, ITU is a membership-driven organization. So key perspectives from ITU. I will start by balancing revenue generation and broader socioeconomic benefits. But before that, I would like to also to highlight the importance of having enabling equitable and sustainable access to ICT globally, which is the licensing framework is playing a key role on network developments, on having good quality of service, and also on bridging the digital divides by having a balance of affordability. So in order to have a good balance with regard to generating revenues and also having more broader socioeconomic benefits, this will lead and contribute to having affordable services which will achieve universal coverage. We at ITU, we encourage member states to adopt long-term policies that align licensing frameworks and policies with the national digital transformation goals. Second, we encourage competition and collaborations. This is specifically having more open and transparent processes to foster a healthy competition, drive innovation, and improve service quality. At the same time we are doing that, we can also have more enabled shared access to spectrum and infrastructure through innovative models such as dynamic spectrum sharing, having universal service policy, and also having what we call wholesale network approach. With this, we can lower the entry barriers to new network operators or to new entrants to the markets, which is contribute to amplifying the coverage in the rural areas or underserved areas. Third, the third perspective that we encourage is to integrate sustainability element into licensing regime or into licensing policies. As we know, in today's context, licensing frameworks should incentivize sustainable practices, specifically with regard to having energy saving or energy efficient networks, and also have a clear policy and regulation with regard to EUS management. On this perspective, ITU support its member states by developing or by advising the government with regard to how to tackle the EUS, having a clear policies and regulations, and also releasing some recommendation on ICT sustainability, which usually guide the regulators and the operators to implement in these directions. The most important perspective also from ITU, which is lead to having more flexibility and adaptability. We all know that we are living in a very rapid evolution of ICT, which is require the policies and regulation to be more flexible and adaptable. This will lead to two importance, which specifically with regard to spectrum. So we have a spectrum reallocation and a spectrum refarming as a mechanism, as an essential to manage these scarce resources. We at ITU, we do have ITU ready regulations, and of course the WRC and Dr. Moghazi has spoken about. So it's a global platform that we discuss issues related to these different models. The fourth and important perspective, which is mainly, I think this session is focusing about, is affordability. So affordability is a critical and a central pillar to a spectrum management as a scarce resources. We here spoke about licensing frameworks. We do usually recommend that it has to be aligned with affordable or the affordability objectives of the government, particularly for low-income users or for those people who live in underserved areas or remote areas. We need to look into them as one of the key players of the ecosystems. ITU support mechanisms such as universal service funds, subsidies, and demand-side incentives to complement licensing regimes and licensing strategies to ensure inclusive connectivity. Those are the main key perspectives with regard to licensing framework to promote a friendly investment in licensing for mobile connectivity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa. I think that was really helpful and insightful from the ITU perspective. For those of you who aren't familiar, the ITU publish a really helpful and informative fifth generation regulatory benchmark, which assesses collaborative regulation across all countries. I think some of the things you discussed are really highlighted in that benchmark, amongst other things. So would encourage you, if you're not familiar, to look at that. It's a good way of comparing and contrasting different approaches. So next, I'd like to invite some comments from Eslam. I think having the perspective from Ericsson is quite interesting here because obviously you don't pay for or use spectrum in the same way as operators, but it's obviously very important to the sort of the Ericsson business model and what you do. So yeah, really good to hear your thoughts. I know you have some slides as well, right? If you need to.
Yeah. Just a couple of slides. This one?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Kalvin. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you today and be in front of this distinguished audience and with the distinguished panelists, my colleagues on the panel. Yes, we at Ericsson, as you know, we are a telecom vendor, but we are a technology company as well. So we are looking at things like this from a more strategic point of view. So if we have like a bird's eye view on this issue. So what is the formula or proposed formula that have the decisive factors for the success or enablement of a good, successful deployment strategy or like connectivity strategy. First, you have to have a vision. And here by vision, we don't mean only the government vision, because it needs a more inclusive with stakeholders involved in this, with a vision for all stakeholders or the operators, telecom vendors, and all other actors in the ecosystem of the telecom industry. And the most important thing in this is the alignment and having the common ground between all these visions to reach the needed objective or the wanted position for the market. Second, to have the right skilled persons in all these organizations that are capable to drive these strategies and deliver on its implementation. Third, it's the incentives. So, and we heard a lot this morning about the incentives and how to incentivize the operators to invest more in the telecom and for the launching and deployment and rollout of 5G. And a lot of like tactics or methods for this incentives, including tax breaks or trade-offs between the spectrum fees and the deployment obligations and license obligations, all this stuff. Then we have the resources. And it's very obvious. The main resource here is the spectrum and the license process around the spectrum and all the regulations that govern all this spectrum supply and spectrum availability. Then you have the implementation plan or the action plan. If you don't have like a plan, time-bounded plan with the clear objectives, the clear KPIs and OQRs, you're going nowhere. So let's have another look on what-if scenarios. If you have this formula, these components, but you are missing all of them, but you are missing the vision. So it's misleading, you're going nowhere. What if you are missing the skills, so we are not capable to implement? Jumping to the third and fourth scenario, if we are missing the incentives. So it's very frustrating and very like discouraging to the operators to invest. And this is not the wanted position, and this is not the objective that all of the stakeholders want to reach. What if you are also missing the resources, the spectrum, which is the key here. So it means nothing for this. So we believe for the spectrum itself, a combination of availability of the low band spectrum on 600 or 700 or 800, combined with a good portion, like what Fatima mentioned this morning, and all the standards and all the studies around the globe say that 100 spectrum contiguous spectrum is the minimum for a meaningful 5G launch and meaningful 5G deployment. So this combination like ensures the affordability, ensures the coverage on the low band, so it's capable to reach long distance, and ensure the capacity as well from the mid-band and the higher mid-band, the lower mid-band. I heard this morning that Dr. Moghazi and Engineer Wael said that, and we know that the government or the NTRA had already a plan for the spectrum supply and the spectrum roadmap for the spectrum for the 5 or 6 years. And this is, I think this is very decisive, and this is the cornerstone for the development or the success of this strategy. In addition to this, for the affordability, I think not only the affordability of the spectrum, but the affordability of the other services, affordability of the devices as well, the handsets that the people will be able to operate and make use of the 5G on it. This is, and I know the government is making good progress in this and having like a lot of initiatives for local manufacturing as well for the handsets, which will support this, especially within the restrictions and the economic hardship and the economic tough conditions that the country is facing and addressing these days, and they have to work around these constraints and being heavily relying on the import only. So this should be also overarched by a regulatory framework with a clear roadmap and a clear plan of what's coming next, predictable regulatory framework that enable this investments as well. And for this, I want to refer to a study that we did like a couple of years ago for the deployment of the 5G on 3 different scenarios. This study is for the 15 emerging markets. with 3 scenarios for the deployment and rollout of the 5G on the existing spectrum, on the low band, expanded low band scenario on other like areas, geographic areas like roads, rails, and agriculture. And third scenario is the extension on the current footprint with extended 5G on the mid-band. And it shows like a general outcome of this, or like results of this study, that across the 15 emerging markets, like the benefit to cost ratio is 3 to 7 times in favor of the benefits for the investments on the 5G. And this is important as well to mention that there is a focus on the consumer use cases for the 5G deployment, and this is very crucial, and this is very important. But there is another use cases, maybe in Egypt we're still in the process or taking the first steps towards this. But this is the main driver for the monetizing and main driver for the economic and social return of the 5G investments, which is the industrial use cases, the agricultural use cases, the logistics use cases, having this applied as well. And this is a new revenue streams as well for the operator that will be like, if have like a clear vision for this and a clear opportunities for this as well, this will incentivize them to put more investments and to be more encouraged to put more money in this development. Thank you.
Thank you, Eslam. Really interesting. Just 2 key points I thought were, well, I thought all of it was really interesting, but 2 key points of note. So the last point you mentioned in terms of achieving the returns from 5G investments. So, I mean, many of you will be aware that in some countries there has been challenges for operators to achieve their sufficient returns on 5G investments. Definitely not in all. Some countries we've seen do better on that. But I think that the point you made is that actually spectrum impacts both sides of that. Both the cost of spectrum impacts the ability for operators to invest, but having that spectrum, that certainty and affordable spectrum then enables improved quality of services that can potentially enable greater use cases that can then pay off in terms of returns on the investment. The other thing I actually did just want to highlight, and especially because you've got it there, is the affordable device. I would definitely echo the importance of that. I think Luis pointed out some of the statistics at the beginning, which is that the global coverage gap now is only 4% of the world's population don't live within the footprint of a mobile broadband network. So when we talk about the digital divide, the vast majority of people who are unconnected do have coverage where they live, but they're not using mobile or internet for other reasons. And what we know from our own research is often the main reason for that is devices not being affordable. So it was really, really good to see that one, that point there too. So next I'd like to bring you and Cameron. I think we've talked obviously about the research we've done, some of the insights from ITU and Ericsson in terms of what's enabling on a spectrum perspective. Obviously, I know we've discussed, and I know you've got very hands-on experience of actually working with policymakers, regulators on spectrum pricing and methods of designing auctions. So I think really looking forward to hearing what you've got, some of the insights you've developed based on your experience in recent years. Yeah, please come up.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much both to the GSMAi for inviting me to speak and for everyone in the room for taking the time to listen to what I've got to say today. So, as Kalvin mentioned, I'm Cameron Currin from Aetha Consulting. We're a small telecoms consultancy based in the UK, but we work globally with both operators and regulators in a range of areas, but one of our particular specialties is spectrum. And over the last few years, we've been involved in more than 100 spectrum awards globally, both in terms of designing the awards and helping operators to bid in those awards. And it's on that experience that I'm really going to be speaking now. So I'm going to try and give a little bit of a view, having heard from Kalvin and the others, of the importance of affordable spectrum in terms of enabling investment and the development of the industry, to try and give a bit more of a practical view from the regulatory side of, how can you come to a a reasonable spectrum price, and also on the operator's side, how they look at spectrum as an investment. So I'm going to start by looking on the kind of regulatory side. And one thing we've mentioned throughout this is spectrum auctions. So I just wanted to quickly start off by talking about why spectrum is auctioned in the context of mobile and perhaps not in other contexts. And I think there's a few elements to this. Probably the most significant is the fact that generally spectrum for mobile services is a scarce resource, and therefore in order to identify an efficient allocation, we need a mechanism to do that. And that's really the main rationale originally for spectrum auctions, is in order to identify that efficient allocation of spectrum. But there's also kind of other elements into this. It simply doesn't work in cases, for example, where sharing is possible. There's not necessary to have an auction process, for example, in that scenario. And also, obviously, in the context of mobile spectrum, we have a kind of practicality element. So in mobile, spectrum tends to be concentrated in a few large spectrum holders, so an auction is practical. When you have disparate, smaller users, it just isn't a practical solution. So that's a kind of starting point in terms of why spectrum auctions are used for mobile spectrum. When a regulator has then decided to auction spectrum, a key question becomes, well, what should the reserve price for that spectrum be? And there's a few kind of key considerations here. And I think starting off, one of the key things is, well, what's the objective of auctioning the spectrum? And going back to what I said at the beginning, really the ultimate objective in all cases should be to identify an efficient allocation of spectrum within the industry. Now, as Kalvin mentioned, there's also potentially incentives and objectives around maximizing revenue for the government. But what I would say is usually maximizing auction revenue alone should not be a top priority for a regulator, because you need to take a kind of wider view of the industry. And obviously, spectrum auctions are only one place where regulators and governments get revenue from industry. And in terms of maximizing those government tax revenues longer term, the best thing that you can do is maximize the growth of the industry. So I would say it is a reasonable objective, but you need to take a wider view than just the auction itself. And then looking at actually setting reserve prices themselves, as we said, the auction objective should be to identify a market price for the spectrum. And therefore, as a starting point, you really want to start below that so that we have some price discovery. So the main focus of the reserve price is really to ensure that there's a minimum return to minimize risk on the regulator, but where possible to allow for a competitive auction that determines a market price. And this is why in most cases we would recommend what we call here the kind of minimum acceptable return approach to the setting of reserve prices. Now, in some cases where the value of the spectrum is less clear, a more conservative approach might be appropriate. So if you're not sure on the value of the spectrum, it's better to go lower than higher. And this means that there's very kind of few situations where we would recommend setting the reserve price for spectrum at the spectrum's full value, because there's a risk there in terms of spectrum remaining unsold. There's also risks in terms of, as a regulator, knowing what the true market value of the spectrum is. So when setting prices based on the full value of the spectrum, you need to be extremely careful and cognizant of the risks that are involved. So now I'm going to kind of move over to the operator's perspective of a spectrum auction. And when you're coming in, looking at how an operator comes to value the spectrum and determine how it's going to bid in an auction. And essentially, we see three main sources of value that we've got listed on the left-hand side here. And they're listed from top to bottom in what is typically descending order of importance. So generally, we see the top technical value as the largest driver of spectrum value for operators, but also increasing order of difficulty to quantify. So if we start at the top, we've got what we call the technical value. And that's in fact by acquiring spectrum, with a smaller number of base stations, you can deploy a larger amount of capacity, you can save costs, and therefore there's a technical value to that spectrum of the costs that you can save. And whilst there are uncertainties looking into the future about how traffic's going to develop, etc., that's something that's readily quantifiable for operators. You also then start looking at what we call the commercial value. So this is, where are the revenue upsides with spectrum? So there's certain things that you can compensate for by deploying more sites or more bands on your sites. So you can add capacity by deploying additional base stations. But you can't entirely offset the impact of not having access to spectrum. And there's going to be, for example, an impact in terms of your peak network speeds that you're able to offer to your subscribers. And therefore, by acquiring spectrum, there's also potentially a revenue upside. Now, that is more difficult to quantify, but it's also an important driver of spectrum value, and that's generally additional to the value that we see related to the kind of technical cost savings. And then finally, we've got what we call here the strategic value for spectrum. And this is kind of broader strategic objectives in terms of ensuring your market position. So by acquiring this spectrum, does it allow you, for example, to deploy an innovative new service? And that's the kind of final, again, potentially important, but generally a more difficult driver of spectrum value to quantify. So we consider all three of these sources of spectrum value when preparing for a spectrum auction. And what we essentially do is build a bottom-up model of an operator's network over the period of the spectrum license. And we see how do costs and revenues change with different amounts of spectrum. And we calculate the enterprise value of the business, and then say, well, how is this changing due to those changes in revenues and costs with different amounts of spectrum? And that's the kind of overall approach and the way that most operators look at spectrum when acquiring it. And this is how the spectrum is valued. There's a very important point, I think, on the bottom right-hand side here, which is to say that the value of the spectrum is related to the price, but it's not the same thing. So an operator is not going to acquire spectrum unless it's going to get a return. And that means that operators are always going to bid for spectrum slightly below their value for it. And that's an important distinction, and it's something that the regulators need to bear in mind when pricing spectrum, is that in order for operators to bid for it and make use of it, they need to be able to generate a return. Okay. So the final thing I just wanted to come on to here is how are spectrum prices developing internationally in recent years. And if you see on the right-hand side here, we've got a chart which shows across the world what is the average price of spectrum in 3 frequency ranges in US dollars per megahertz per head of population. And what we see is that in the 5G era, so since 2019, the price of spectrum has generally been decreasing, and it's been converging between the different frequency bands. So there's now less of a premium for low frequency spectrum as those large contiguous 5G carriers that we've spoken about earlier have become increasingly important. And the main reason that we see the price of spectrum going down over time is fairly simple. So generally, in most markets, operators' revenues are fairly stagnant. They might be growing, but generally at a rate below inflation. At the same time, the requirements of subscribers in terms of traffic are going up. That requires more spectrum. So we have more spectrum in the market. And if we simply kind of compare the two, essentially there's now lower value being generated per megahertz of spectrum used on an operator's network. And that inevitably results in spectrum prices reducing over time. And the key kind of upshot of this is that we need to be very careful when setting prices based on past benchmarks of spectrum prices, because the value of spectrum is something that is not static. So we need to bear this in mind when we're doing kind of backward-looking benchmarking studies to set prices. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Cameron. It was really some really interesting both insights there and also analysis. I think we still do have 20-25 minutes. I do actually have a few follow-up questions personally, but given obviously we've got a very good panel here, I'm going to open up the floor to see if there are any questions for any of our panelists about anything we've discussed or anything linked to the topic around spectrum pricing, policy and investment. So put your hand up if, we've got someone with a microphone. Anyone with any questions? If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself just before you speak so everyone knows who everyone is.
Dr. Rora Hassan from NTRA. My question is for Cameron. How do you see the puzzles of affordability, spectrum pricing, and the rural area from your perspective as expertise? Thank you.
Okay, so there's obviously various elements to this and the way that spectrum can be used as a way of enabling affordable connectivity in rural areas. So I would say there's kind of two main elements here. So firstly, obviously, spectrum is an enabler. So there's a key objective really to make sure that the spectrum is available to extend connectivity. And that means particularly in the rural areas, I think low frequency spectrum is a priority. So making sure that spectrum is available to operators is very key. And then in terms of the pricing, the second element is that it requires investment in order to actually deploy this spectrum. And often in the rural areas, the problem underlying this is that it's not necessarily economic for an operator to deploy services or sites in those areas. And that's really where the government's kind of role and the regulator's role comes in. And there's lots of different approaches that have been applied internationally. But for example, in Brazil, they allowed any bids above reserve price in an auction to be converted into investment in specified areas in deploying the spectrum. So there's ways that awards can be designed in order to do that. Obviously, the key thing that you need to be aware of when doing that is that the cost of any obligations is essentially a cost for spectrum. It's not paid directly to the government, but it is a cost for the spectrum, and therefore you need to be aware of that when setting prices. So whether that's by allowing spectrum fee discounts directly or setting a lower price for spectrum, it just needs to be aware. But I think there's quite a few different ways you can kind of link together. And obviously there's a lot of money related to spectrum auctions. So it's a great opportunity to kind of keep that money and that investment in the industry in order to extend the connectivity. So hopefully that answers.
Thank you, Cameron. No, that's really good. Any other questions? Yes, there's one here.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Fadel Daigam from the National Telecom Regulatory Authority of Egypt. Actually, the first is a comment. I think in terms of the value you already mentioned, I think strategic value you mean is also including the social value. If this is the case, just the second question is, you said you already participated in more than 100 auctions worldwide. As you know, there are different variations of auctions. For example, like the first prize, second prize, simultaneous, sequential, whatever it is. Can you give some sort of recommendation or best practices? Which one was more viable throughout all your experiences? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So on the first question, I think we need to some extent, draw a distinction here in terms of who accrues that social value. So if you're looking from the operator's perspective, obviously it is a business, and there are objectives in terms of social value, but the primary aim is to gain a return on an investment. So the real beneficiaries of the social value are the consumers, and by extension, that's the role of the regulators is to find incentives and ways to incentivize operators to unlock those social values. So I would say it's not a key consideration necessarily for operators when valuing spectrum, and that's why it's something that the regulators need to concentrate on when they're designing auction rules, for example. To move on to your second question, obviously there's a wide range of auction formats internationally. On your first question related to kind of first price and second price sealed bids, what I would say is generally a second price auction is preferable, and the main reason for that is when you have a first price bid, you are incentivized as an operator to reduce and what we call shade your bid to make sure that you minimize the amount that you are spending. But the problem is you don't know how much other people are shading their bids. So what you risk in a first price auction like that is an inefficient outcome, not because someone doesn't have higher value for spectrum, but because they have taken the strategic decision to shade more than another operator that has less value. So there's quite significant risks related to first price auctions in that respect. In terms of the auction formats that I would recommend, generally speaking, I'd say in most countries, it's better to keep a fairly simple award structure. And for that reason, I would say typically a multi-round, either a SMRA, a simultaneous multi-round auction, or a clock auction would be the most suitable in most countries. There are other potentially more advanced auction formats that you could use, like the SMRA clock hybrid, but they are more difficult to implement, and there's risks related to that. So I would say in most cases, either the SMRA or the clock would be preferable.
Thank you, Cameron. That's great. Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cameron, and the other panelists for this valuable information and insights shared with us. I am Mohammed Abdel Hassi from NTRA. My question is for Cameron as well. For the spectrum pricing, as we see that some countries make some benchmarking in order to make some value for this spectrum, and how I can make this spectrum available for the operators. So while I make some benchmark between, as you mentioned, lower band, mid band, and millimeter wave bands, So what is the appropriate approach that can be made by the operator, the regulator, in order to evaluate the spectrum fees or spectrum price or the value of this spectrum to be affordable for the operator? This is the first one. Second one, as you mentioned, there is different values, like we mentioned in the last slide, about the values between some countries from different years, from starting 2019 till now, and the price of the spectrum is decreasing year by year. So while I make a benchmark for this spectrum, which approach is appropriate? To have the spectrum price index as an indicator in order to evaluate this spectrum, or to have megahertz per pop per capita, per GDP capita as a normalization in order to evaluate the spectrum in my country? So can you have some insight with us, share it with us, which approach is appropriate in our country to be used in this era?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So I'll start by just, talking perhaps about the overall rationale for using benchmarks as opposed to other valuation techniques, particularly as a regulator. Now, one of the key things, obviously, is when you're valuing spectrum as an operator and you do a bottom-up model like I described, you are looking 15 years, 20 years into the future, depending on your license, and there's some quite significant assumptions to do with that. And obviously, an operator has potentially more insight to its own network, how traffic is currently developing. So they're often in a more strong position than a regulator to do that kind of forward-looking analysis, which is why often regulators go for a benchmarking, because it's a more direct insight to the market value in other countries. Obviously, in terms of why it's generally a price per megahertz per pop that we compare, that's just in order to provide a normalization, a reasonable comparison to enable like-for-like comparison between countries, and just gives a metric to enable that. But it's quite common to then make other adjustments in order to take account of the specific situation in that country. So commonly, people will do a wealth adjustment. So purchasing power parity tends to be the international standard to account for the fact that generally a wealthier country is going to have higher ARPUs, operators are able to get a greater return on their spectrum. So it's common to do a wealth adjustment there in order to do a like-for-like. And I think the final thing I'll mention in terms of benchmarking approaches, related to that chart I showed, you need to make sure that you are restricting your benchmark to a reasonable time period such that you're looking at the current value of spectrum and reflecting the fact that that is changing over time. Sorry, there were quite a few elements to your question, but hopefully that covers most of them, and I'd be pleased to discuss more offline. Yeah.
It's a really good point. Actually, on that, I actually just wanted to bring a couple of thoughts there from both Eslam and Dr. Mustafa as well, because I think the reasons Cameron articulated in terms of why we've seen spectrum prices coming down, so some of the issues around stagnant revenue, I certainly completely agree with based on the data. And I think you also explained very well, Cameron, that when sort of valuing spectrum and looking at spectrum strategies, we're talking over long time frames, 15, 20 years, sometimes more, and we're talking about a very fast-moving sector. So any regulator or economist who was valuing spectrum in the early 2000s, I think they could be forgiven for not foreseeing what would happen with the smartphone, with YouTube, and how spectrum will be utilized 20 years. And that, yes, in terms of valuation, we can reflect that through different sensitivities, but it's such this sector is so fast moving that it's quite difficult to really forecast that with any certainty. And now we know there's technology changes with things like AI, but we don't really know what that's going to happen. So first, I guess on your side, Eslam, so with that in mind, how can we reflect that in terms of spectrum policy? What's a good way of managing whether a spectrum affordability or policy when we're talking about long licenses with really fast-moving technologies?
Yes, thank you, Kalvin. I think, as you said, it needs a long-term revision. It needs a conducive policy framework, not only for the spectrum, but all the other aspects that govern and have input on the spectrum pricing and the availability of the spectrum. I see the government, the ways of working of the government now is enabling for this. We have like a government and government working groups happening in Egypt, economic working groups and like the entrepreneurship working group as well. All these are like good forums and good platform to discuss the good mechanisms and the appropriate mechanism to have this long term with all stakeholders from the government combined in the same room, on the same table, have these visions, because we heard not from the government, from other stakeholders that taxes is not in the hand of the NTRA. Yes, right, but it's in the hand of the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Finance is sitting beside the NTRA and the Minister of ICT. So it's the same one government, and I believe the enablers are there. So having this conducive regulatory framework, we see there is a lot of components in this regulatory framework is there already in the telecom and IT side as well. Embracing and the putting the privacy and the security of the networks on first place as well for this development of this regulatory framework, and have this open conversation and transparent conversation with all the stakeholders as well, to have the benefits of the, as you said and as Cameron said, the best practices and the what works well in other markets. Not to copy this, but just to have this as a reference. Egypt is a very unique country. Doesn't mean that you have this best practice and copy here in Egypt. It will not work. Something rated, for instance, for the spectrum pricing. We have a lot of benchmarking for spectrum pricing, but a decisive component in this and how to relate this spectrum pricing to the social and economic use for the return on this, not just for the benchmarking of having this equal this. So. Yes, I think this is the most important thing in this.
Yeah. No, I think I'd agree with all of that. Dr. Mustafa, similar question to you, this sort of question as to how we manage spectrum policy assignment over very long time periods where we see really, really fast-moving changes.
Yes, thank you, Kalvin. Just I will take the last point or the way mentioned by my colleague Eslam. So I think always talking about the 3 C's, collaboration, coordination, and cooperation, which is very important to reflect on a spectrum framework, this policy, which is also lead to having agile regulatory framework, and I believe it's contribute to the network development, having good accessibility, availability of service, and of course affordability. So those 3. Affordability and availability and accessibility, with having a clear and agile regulatory frameworks will contribute to having a balance between licensing and affordability. The second important thing is also we need to look into the main core principles for spectrum pricings, considering the public interest and also considering the private interest. It is a matter of not 100% equality, but you need, governments always to consider the public interest and also to consider the private interest, with having equality to the spectrum for those who are actively using the spectrum, to have transparency in the process. This is very important. Coordinations in terms of informing in advance the networks or the market players with regard to changes to spectrum pricing, and of course having affordable price, which is by the end is contribute to the accessibility to the service.
No, thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm just going to look to my colleague. Are we wrapping up soon, or do we still have time for a couple of more questions? We still have time? 10 minutes? Okay, oh great. Yeah, so we've still got time for some questions. If anyone, yep, I think there's one there.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Abdel Ghani. I am Telecom Infrastructure Development Executive Director at NTRA. And thanks to you, Kalvin, and to all your distinguished panelists for their insights in presentation. It came to my notice that during Kalvin's presentation, he highlighted the role of infrastructure sharing in bridging the connectivity gap and reaching the connectivity goals for each MNO. So you know that in Egypt, if we take a snapshot on our local MNOs, we'll see different footprint and connectivity map for each operator. So I would then try to ask you if you could give us some more insights or best practice based on your knowledge and analysis experience on how to foster or get the infrastructure sharing to its full potential in Egypt in reaching connectivity targets, especially in the rural and underserved areas. If you could give us some more insights on this. Thank you.
It's a very good question and very important. Don't know, so we've done some work on that, but I don't know if our panelists, anyone want to take that one around infrastructure sharing?
Okay, I can. Yeah. Thank you for this very interesting questions. So one of the recommended mechanism to also have, last mile connectivity, if I may say, so is to use the national roaming. This is also support the approach of infrastructure sharing. So this is one of the recommended approach, but it's of course it's need a clear policy in advance from the government to adopt this kind of mechanism. We have several cases in the regions, in Arab Union specifically, those who have implemented the national roaming. Another mechanism that usually government uses, which is the number portability, is also supporting the government objectives with regard to digital development agenda. So infrastructure sharing, national roaming, and number portability.
Yes, if I may add to this as well, in addition to what Mustafa had just said, like adopting new technologies in connectivity, like the fixed wired access as well, helps a lot. Like an affordable technology that could be able to like provide meaningful connectivity in rural areas as well, to lessen this digital divide or the connectivity gap in rural areas as well. So the combination between the traditional technologies and new technologies, the most affordable one like the fixed wire access would be like good solution, good approach in this as well.
Yes, so on the topic of infrastructure sharing, I think there was just one kind of point I wanted to add here, which is related to the the regulation of infrastructure sharing. I think the key thing I'd just highlight is that obviously operators are incentivized to share their networks. There is a clear market incentive for that because they can essentially save costs in doing so. So the need for regulatory intervention in that sense, I would say, is somewhat limited because those market incentives are already there. And if you try and intervene too much, obviously operators need to be able to gain a return on their investments in infrastructure. So if you start kind of getting into the business of, for example, mandating infrastructure sharing, it can become challenging because essentially you are mandating access to an investment that an operator has made with the expectation of a return. So I would just kind of advise some caution with respect to the regulation of it, because I think there's strong market forces that incentivize it anyway and can lead to strong outcomes.
Yeah, just to add, I would echo all of that. We've another bit of research we have done has been looking at the impact of network sharing, both amongst sort of the passive element, the active equipment element, and also spectrum sharing. And indeed, we found that that has resulted in wider coverage, better speeds, lower prices as well, all for the reasons that the panelists mentioned, that there's a strong incentive to do so. But where you get into the area of possibly mandating, then you potentially run the risk of a potential regulatory failure there. I would perhaps flag, obviously, but myself being from the UK, we have an interesting example there where there was a rural coverage gap identified, and one of the solutions the government did to that was rather than rather than sort of impose an obligation on rural coverage, they consulted with the operators and they said, right, we know where the coverage gaps are, particularly in these rural areas, and they developed what was called a shared rural network, where there was one network built that all the operators could share. They all had made different investment commitments, and then that was part funded by operators and government as well. So again, it's not mandated, but it's more based on some of the approaches that Dr. Mustafa mentioned about sort of collaborating and identifying an approach to address that market failure. Any others? I think one or two more. Yep, gentleman at the front.
Thank you very much for the interesting panel. My name is Yahya Mhasib. I'm from the Arab Academy for Science and Technology. It's not a question, rather it's a follow-up to what Cameron was saying, because usually when you mandate infrastructure sharing, this is through public-private partnerships. So if the government is paying for part of the infrastructure, it has every right to mandate this sharing. The other part is that we are seeing in 6G, and probably it was planned for 5G as well, what's called open radio access networks. And with open access, you're actually opening the radio access. There has to be some sort of regulatory. On the other hand, for the last mile technologies like FTTX, we see open FTTX, which is sort of imposing the same. So they're imposing the same concept of infrastructure sharing. And there are many problems that come with that. And I beg to differ that we do need a strong role from the operator to set up the rules and the business models and accessibility for that. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. No, very interesting. Anything? I think we've probably got time for one more question. If anyone wants to go. Anyone? No, we're well overdue for lunch, aren't we? So I think that's probably a limiting factor. Well, firstly, I really wanted to say thank you for all of the panelists. It was really interesting and insightful. Also wanted to thank all of you as well for asking some really good questions, very thought-provoking, and made us think about these issues too. So I think we will finish there. Hand over to Luis, I believe we've got lunch next. But if you have any questions for our panelists, I'm sure they won't mind discussing. Similarly, if there's any questions about what we've done here at the GSMAi, happy to talk over lunch and follow up both here and after this workshop. Thank you, everyone.